Now that David, spelled d4vd, has been ordered to stand trial on charges related to the death of Rivas Hernandez, we already know that he could potentially face the death penalty. But there's a much bigger question surrounding that aspect. If David is eventually convicted of these charges, should he actually get the death penalty? Or would spending the rest of his life in prison be the harsher and more appropriate punishment? Now, the reason I even started thinking about this particular topic is because the other day, I was watching a video from Bruce Rivers. I'm sure a lot of you guys know who Bruce is. He's a criminal defense lawyer who regularly breaks down major cases online. And while discussing the possibility of the death penalty in David's case, Bruce made a statement that really got me thinking.
And in this case, you not only have to present enough evidence of the case itself, but also these underlying factors that give rise to the death penalty. Ooh, did I say the death penalty? I'm opposed to the death penalty. I just am. It's not equally applied. You know, I had somebody call me one day and said I was a piece of shit for being opposed to the death penalty. I just don't think the government should be in the business of killing. I just don't.
And that brought up a few questions in my head that, honestly, I had never really stopped to think about before. Why does the death penalty even exist? And what is it actually supposed to accomplish? Is it about punishment? Is it about justice? Is it about revenge? Is it about deterrence? And when you apply those questions specifically to the David case, assuming he is eventually convicted as charged, would death actually be the most appropriate punishment? Or would forcing him to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars be even worse? That is really what I want to explore in this video. So what exactly is the death penalty? The simplest way to describe it is this. The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, is when the government legally executes someone as punishment for a crime they have been convicted of committing. In other words, instead of sentencing someone to spend the rest of their life in prison, the state decides that the crime was so serious that the person should be put to death. And when you really stop and think about that, it is an extremely serious power for any government to have. We're talking about the government deciding that another human being has committed an act so terrible that they no longer deserve to remain alive. And considering the severity of the allegations in this case, it's really easy to understand why that's even a possibility. But that immediately raises another question. What is the death penalty actually supposed to accomplish? And I've been really thinking about this. Is it supposed to protect society? Is it supposed to discourage other people from committing similar crimes? Is it solely meant to provide justice for the victim and their family? Or is it ultimately a form of revenge carried out through the legal system? Because depending on how you look at it, your answer to whether David should receive the death penalty could be completely different. And before applying that question directly to David, it is worth looking at how the death penalty is viewed outside of this one case. So the death penalty is still legal in parts of the United States and in several other countries, but most countries have either abolished it or stopped using it altogether. And I think that says something, because for thousands of years, humans have responded to killing with more killing. Before modern courts, serious crimes could lead to families taking revenge, tribes retaliating, or one side killing somebody because the other side had killed one of theirs. But as governments and legal systems became more organized, they gradually took the power to punish people away from individuals. The idea became, you cannot take revenge into your own hands. The state will investigate what happened, hold some form of legal proceeding, which today would typically mean a trial, and ultimately determine that person's fate. And obviously that is very different from allowing people to personally hunt down and kill whoever they believe wronged them. But it still leaves us with one major question. When someone has been captured, given a fair trial, and proven guilty, should death still be one of the punishments the government is allowed to impose? Some people would say yes. They would argue that certain crimes are so evil that death is the only punishment severe enough to match what happened. Other people, that would be world leaders, religious figures, and human rights groups, believe the government should never have the power to intentionally take someone's life.
Is the death penalty right or wrong?
I used to think it was right, but as I've had more experiences, I'm completely against it.
Especially when that person can instead be permanently separated from society through life in prison. And this is where one of the biggest moral questions surrounding the death penalty comes into play. See, the punishment is permanent, but the justice system is not perfect. People have been sentenced to death only for new evidence to later show that they did not commit the crime. Since 1973, at least 202 people in the United States have been exonerated and released from death row. And that raises the obvious concern. If that many people were cleared before they were executed, how can we ever be completely certain that an innocent person has not already been put to death? There have also been cases where a person was executed only for serious questions about their guilt to continue growing afterward. And once that happens, there's no fixing it. You cannot release them from prison. You cannot return the years that were taken from them. And you definitely cannot give them their life back. The government has already carried out a punishment that can never be reversed. And one of the most famous examples is Cameron Todd Willingham. Cameron Todd Willingham was a Texas man who prosecutors accused of intentionally setting fire to his home, killing his 3 young daughters. A jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on February 17, 2004. But even today, there is still major disagreement over whether the Texas government executed a guilty man or an innocent one.
Hearst had come to believe Todd Willingham was not guilty.
Todd Willingham's case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson. Not one iota.
Now, Cameron Todd Willingham's former wife later said that she believed he was guilty and claimed that he confessed to her before his execution. But that claim remains heavily disputed. In earlier accounts, she reportedly did not make that confession claim, and members of Willingham's family argue that her account changed over time.
Thousands of death penalty opponents say Stacy Kirkendall's ex-husband was an innocent man put to death. She says that's not what Todd Willingham told her.
He burnt them. He admitted he burnt them to me, and he was convicted for his crime.
She made that statement before a scheduled hearing that could have exonerated Willingham from the murders, but attorney Gerald Goldstein, who's representing the Willingham family, says Kirkendall is better served making her statement before a judge.
Now, this is not a case where every piece of evidence clearly proves that he was in fact innocent. The controversy is that the specific evidence used to prove the fire was intentionally started was later heavily criticized as outdated and unreliable. Now, that does not mean every person who claims innocence on death row is actually innocent, but it does prove that juries, prosecutors, and witnesses and forensic experts can all make mistakes. And if the punishment is life in prison, there's at least a possibility of correcting that mistake later. But if the punishment is death, the mistake becomes permanent. So when people argue against the death penalty, sometimes it's not because they feel sympathy for murderers and killers. It's because they don't trust any human system enough to give it the irreversible power to kill. And that is basically the point Bruce Rivers was making. He said he opposes the death penalty because it is not applied equally and because he does not believe the government should be in the business of killing people. But even Bruce acknowledged that this is an especially heinous case. And I think that is what makes this conversation so difficult. You can look at the allegations in David's case and feel like this is exactly the type of case where the death penalty would make sense. But at the same time, objectively speaking, you're still giving an imperfect and unequal system the permanent power to decide who lives and who dies. And that leads into the other part of Bruce's argument. The death penalty has not always been applied equally. The outcome can depend on where the crime happened, which prosecutor handled the case, and how good the person's lawyer was. So that means two people accused of similarly serious crimes can receive completely different punishments. And that may help explain why America has become more hesitant to use it. In 1999, the United States executed 98 people, the highest number recorded in any year since executions resumed in 1976. Roughly 1/3 of those executions took place in Texas alone. But since then, both executions and new death sentences have dropped significantly. That doesn't necessarily mean people stopped believing certain crimes deserve death. It may mean more people started questioning whether the punishment can be applied fairly, consistently, and without killing the wrong person. Still, one of the biggest arguments in favor of the death penalty is deterrence. The idea that the threat of execution could make someone think twice before committing murder. But that argument assumes the person is actually thinking about the punishment beforehand. Many murders happen in moments of anger, panic, or extreme emotion. Others involve drugs or alcohol, and some are committed by people who simply believe they will never be caught. And if someone expects to get away with it, they are probably not comparing life in prison to the death penalty, because in their mind, they're expecting neither. Now, when you apply that to this case, prosecutors are not describing something impulsive. They are alleging that It was deliberate and involved planning and efforts to avoid detection. But even then, the same question remains. If the person believed they could hide the crime and avoid punishment altogether, would the death penalty have stopped them? Or does it only punish them after they have already been caught? And once they have been caught and permanently separated from society, what is the point of taking their life? Another argument against the death penalty is the idea of a life for a life. If someone takes a life, does justice really require the government to take theirs in return? Or is that simply revenge being carried out through the legal system? But supporters of the death penalty see it differently. They believe certain crimes are so severe that life in prison is not enough. And if David is eventually convicted as charged, this is exactly the kind of case they would point to. From that perspective, life without parole could still feel too lenient. The person convicted would remain alive, able to speak to people, receive letters, and continue experiencing life from inside prison. Meanwhile, the person whose life was taken, Celeste Rivas, gets none of that. So supporters would ask, if someone intentionally takes an innocent life, why should they still be allowed to keep theirs? And when you apply that argument to the David case, again, only if he is convicted as charged, it becomes emotionally difficult to dismiss. David's situation is also unusual because of how successful he became before any of this happened. His career generated millions of dollars. His music reached billions of streams, and even now, people are still listening to it. Depending on his contracts and what he owns, parts of that catalog could still continue generating money for a very long time. And whatever resources he already has could help him keep paying lawyers, filing appeals, and pursuing every legal option available to him, even if he were eventually convicted. That would not make the day-to-day reality of prison any less restrictive, but it could give him greater financial access to private lawyers, investigators, and other legal resources than the average prisoner has. And that adds another layer to what life imprisonment versus the death penalty would actually mean in his particular case. Now this brings us to the victim's family, Celeste Rivas Hernandez. For them, a death sentence could mean years of appeals, additional hearings, and constant reminders that the legal process is still not over. Some families may still believe that only death properly represents what was taken from them. Others may prefer the certainty of life without parole, knowing the person will never leave prison without having to wait decades for an execution that may never happen. And when I think about David specifically, I can understand the argument that life in prison could actually be the harsher punishment. This is somebody who experienced an extraordinary level of success at a very young age. He traveled, performed in front of massive crowds, made millions of dollars, and lived in the Hollywood Hills while his career was taking off. He already knows what freedom, fame, and opportunity feels like. Basically, David has an appetite for the finer things in life. So imagine going from that life to spending every remaining day inside prison. He would remember the traveling, the money, the music, the crowds, and everything he once had, while knowing that he will never experience any of it again. However, a death sentence would at least carry the possibility that his punishment could one day reach a final ending. Life without parole would force him to wake up every day knowing that there is no end date and no path back to the life he lost. And when we talk about spending the rest of your life behind bars, we have to think about what that actually means. You watch your parents and family members grow older from a distance. You miss funerals, weddings, birthdays, and every major moment happening outside. You lose your privacy and control over the most basic parts of your life. You cannot decide where you go, when you leave a room, who you see, or how you spend your time. Relationships can slowly fade. Visits can become less frequent, and eventually the outside world begins moving on without you. Then there's the reality of prison itself. We all know people convicted of harming children are not exactly looked upon kindly behind bars. And David is locked up in California, where Latino culture has a major presence, both outside and inside the prison system. Celeste herself came from a Salvadoran family. So a case involving a 14-year-old Salvadoran American girl could carry an especially personal weight for some Latino inmates who know about this case, right? Now, I of course cannot predict that any particular group would target David, but between the nature of the charges and the complicated racial and neighborhood politics inside California prisons, it probably would not be an easy environment for him to navigate. Let's just put it like that. Also, the prison system could house him according to his custody level and safety needs. But either way, life without parole would not mean sitting comfortably in a cell while his music continues making money outside. It would mean living inside an environment with its own rules, threats, pressures, and politics, and knowing that he may have to survive there for the rest of his natural life. And even if David were sentenced to death, that process would not happen overnight. Death penalty cases can remain tied up in appeals and legal challenges for decades. So even if David eventually receives a death sentence, he could remain incarcerated for decades before an execution is actually executed. And under California's current policy, it may never happen at all. So that raises the central question again. Would it be worse for him to know that his punishment may eventually come to an end, or to know that there is no end date and that every year he has left will be spent behind bars? Now, although David is eligible for the death penalty, that does not mean he is guaranteed to receive it. Prosecutors have not announced whether they will seek death. And even if prosecutors seek death, David would first have to be convicted of first-degree murder. At least one special circumstance allegation would have to be found true, and all 12 jurors would have to agree on a death sentence during a separate penalty phase. So there's still a very long legal road ahead. But this case does start an important conversation about what the harshest punishment truly is and what justice is supposed to accomplish. I think most people would agree that if somebody intentionally takes an innocent life under circumstances this serious, they should never be allowed to return to society. But whether they should also lose their own life is where people begin to disagree. Some people believe certain crimes are so severe that death is the only punishment equal to what was taken. Others believe keeping that person alive, permanently stripped of their freedom and forced to live with the consequences every day, may actually be worse. And honestly, I can understand both sides. If David is eventually convicted as charged, I would understand why people believe he should receive the death penalty. But personally, I'm actually not convinced that execution would necessarily be the harsher punishment. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier. For somebody who experienced money, fame, freedom, and a life most people could only dream about, spending the rest of his natural life locked away, watching the world move on and knowing he will never return to that life may be a much more intense punishment than death. But that's just what I personally think. I'm very curious to hear what you guys think. If David is eventually convicted as charged, should he receive the death penalty, or would life in prison without the possibility of parole actually be worse? I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say. You guys let me know in the comment section below. Subscribe if you're new here. My name is Blackie Speaks. Nice to meet you. Definitely like this video. I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Peace. I'm out.